Welcome back all to the to the panel Rate, Comment, Subscribe, moderated by Petra Heck, a freelance curator based in Amsterdam. And they will be talking on how social media influenced the work of Brad Troemel, Amalia Ulman, and Dullaart, who we are very happy that they all could make it. Well, have fun.
Yes, thanks all for coming here, and thanks for inviting me and us for this panel. Constance, Dillard, Brad Troemel, Amalia Ulman. We'd like to discuss the way social media have influenced their practice or the practice of art. We can see, at least I'd like to discuss what their practices in relation to social media consist of, what their attitudes are in this. And we can see how far we can get with that. I'd like to introduce Brad first, and he will then briefly present one of his projects, and then afterwards Amalia and then Constance. Brad Troemel is an American artist, writer and blogger based in New York, most well known for his development of the Tumblr website, Jogging. His work is a binding factor for a number of different potentially competing forms of valuation, whether it's bitcoins, organic foods, or precious metals. And his writing tends to focus on the internet, configurations of art and experience on the internet, and visual culture. Go ahead, Brad.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Brad. I took the panel's title to be a talk about audiences and our relationship with audiences as they occur through social media. And so the project that I want to talk about most in relation to that was a project called Jogging that I started in 2008 with Lauren Christensen. And we started in Chicago. I think it was kind of a project born out of a couple realizations that I had, both running a gallery at the time and then also kind of being young and failing as an artist. And one of the things that I noticed that I was doing when I was making my own art, and I still do, but back then it was probably 2007 or so, I was doing pretty crappy Burned and Hillebesher impersonations where I would get these, I'd photograph the same thing 100 plus times, make these grids of it. And I found that when I was releasing these grids on social media, they tended to take up the same amount of real estate visually as people's lunch decisions or people's vacation photos or selfies or anything else. That effectively I was putting in all of this labor into an image this size, and then it was being overrun by all these other things that could happen so much more instantaneously that didn't require quite as much labor. And so the kind of attention that was being paid to them was on par with all these other things. So I realized that if I wanted to kind of exist in harmony with social media, if I wanted to garner an audience through social media, I had to kind of work with it and work through it. I couldn't resist it this way. I'd have to figure it out from the inside out and try to do something with the kinds of attitudes that already existed there. So I decided that one of the key things then in forming Jogging was that it would be a type of project that would syncopate labor, that it would kind of spread labor out. It would make it rapid and consistent, where instead of putting all of your labor into one thing, it would be chopped up and kind of spread and dispersed over the course of time, and that this would be a more kind of apt way of engaging with an audience so as to form visibility. And visibility, of course, is especially when it comes to art on the internet, an absolute necessity in terms of garnering an audience for yourself. If you just put art somewhere into the internet without actively trying to find or actively trying to cultivate an audience for yourself, it's like if a tree falls in the forest or something like this, right? And so visibility for me, even at the start, was I knew that it would be the entry point to all these other things I wanted. So so my end game being to innovate and to become part of art history and to respond to the artists that came before me, but also to respond to the time that I lived in. I wanted to gain awareness and gain maybe respect from my peers, but at least awareness from my peers. And then ultimately, I wanted to make a living for myself. So if I wanted to do these three things, I would have to find a way of initiating some audience for myself. So Jogging was maybe the first active attempt at this. And it started with physical object making. Basically, like I said, I was running a gallery at the time, and Lauren and I would take leftover scraps from exhibitions that we would throw, and we would just kind of like reassemble them, collage them, whatever, put them up on the wall, photograph them, take them down, put the image post up, reassemble them once again using the same parts and photograph them in the gallery to give them a kind of institutional sheen, and then put them back down. So the work only existed for the purpose of becoming a post on a blog. And eventually we learned that if we wanted to work even more rapidly, if we wanted our labor to be even more concentrated so that we could get more out of less, or more out of less, we could eventually start using some of the things native to like a digital landscape. We could start using Google image search. We could start using Photoshop. So we started incorporating these kinds of digital aspects of images alongside physical aspects. We started kind of compositing images rather than purely making objects. We started photoshopping materials that we'd like to work with into our sculptures rather than materials we had the money to buy. And that this would be a way of making more things more often. And eventually, over the course of time, it really wasn't, in terms of making these posts, it really wasn't about any one post being a masterpiece, but rather that we would form a mimetic language over time, that we would use a certain type of material, that we joke in a certain type of way, that we'd make certain type of gestures, and that people could recognize a style or a kind of affect of the performance of our consistent labor, rather than focus on any one thing as a title masterpiece or something. So eventually, Jogging got opened up to submissions. Once we felt that we had established this kind of mimetic language, that people could actively describe what a jogging post looked like, that this would afford people then the opportunity to innovate on this format. And that's what they did. And I think that's really when the project took off. That's when posts stopped having 100 or 200 notes and started having 1,000 notes, and then they started having hundreds of thousands of notes. And it really started going viral in a way that we hadn't anticipated. And I think a lot of this had to do with the fact that we had just been thinking about, if we make this project, if we make this type of work, hopefully the art world will pay attention to us. But really, the art world didn't pay attention to us at all. We still don't have any write-ups in major magazines about the project Jogging. There's been no serious scholarship dedicated to or anything like that. The people that liked the project were like teens in suburban America mostly, but also in other European countries. And I'm really happy about that. A lot of the people that came to follow the project were not, as I said, art world people at all, but rather people who are just kind of these Tumblr junkies and stuff like that, which was great. And I think that one of what I also appreciate about what they did was that they came to use the images in ways that we had not anticipated at all either, that this kind of expanded audience had expanded reasons for interacting with these images that we hadn't anticipated. And I think that I've written about this previously, and I'm trying to get through it, I'm sorry. I've written about this previously, and one of the things that I took away from that in terms of my relationship with that audience was I think a lot about David Josselit's terms. He has these terms, image fundamentalism and image neoliberalism, and he uses these terms to describe the previous ways that we've kind of thought of the way that art is both valued and the audience's relationship with the art. So in the case of image fundamentalism, we think of like the Greek columns or something like this. It's an absolute necessity that they are where they are. They relate to a specific time and place, and they have a specific relationship with a maker and an audience relative to that space. Then image neoliberalism, Josselit describes as this kind of more of this culturally migratory stewardship form that we accept through institutions where famous Picassos move from one ocean to the other, and that the value of the work is garnered through its kind of stewardship and its ability to be seen in a multiplicity of spaces. Now, image anarchism, which is what I think Jogging kind of perpetuated, it probably isn't the inventor of it by any means, but it was an example of it, would be the idea that an image or that a kind of cultural product could exist in a multiplicity of spaces and mean a multiplicity of things to a multiplicity of people and have no owner whatsoever. So there is no steward, there is no specific place it needs to be seen, and that the audiences locally identify a meaning with it separate from where it initially came from, right? And this is basically the thesis of an essay that I wrote called The Accidental Audience, which you can read, which is all about audiences and social media and how Jogging started interacting with people outside the art world. And maybe I'll just leave it there. And maybe I can talk about more stuff as time goes on. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Brad. Amalia Ulman is an Argentinian-born, Spanish-raised artist who, although is mostly Wi-Fi based internationally, has an office in downtown LA. Her works are primarily voiced in the first person, often blurring the distinction between the artist and object of study. In a multidisciplinary manner, she explores the relationship between consumerism, identity, class imitation, and social deception, altruism, and empathy. Amalia?
Hello. Okay, so I thought it was like 5-minute introduction, so now I feel kind of embarrassed because I don't have that much material, I think. So yeah, my main, first of all, my use of the internet is accidental, because I just work with the tools that are around me, and like internet happens to be one of them, but like I work with many other platforms. But I guess I invited here because of the project I did on Instagram. So my main interest is people and the roles they choose to perform to participate in different power structures, and also the objects they choose to do this with. So I previously have looked to class divide and different social relations, but specifically about women's role in society and their expectations related to femininity, how much of a role-playing game this is. The mother, the Lolita, the hot babe, the female artist, the woman in the like creative industry, or the whore. And that's why I've always been also interested in the idea of cute, and definitely things like the beauty myth. And that's why I've done research on plastic surgery as well, because of how all of us monetize on our assets consciously or unconsciously, and how that helps for better ladder climbing. And yeah, finally, I tend to appropriate the aesthetics of the middle class and what is considered to be normal, of things that are so normal that are almost invisible and we no longer see. And that's my favorite, those are my favorite topics to make work with. That includes, obviously, hospitals and waiting rooms and airports and like these kind of decals that I usually appropriate and curate for different shows that I've had. Yeah, so that's it. I guess I'll let Constant talk, and then with the question answers, I'll talk more about the work.
Thank you, Amalia. And Constant Dillard is a Dutch artist living mostly in Berlin. He focuses on visualizing internet vernaculars and software dialects. Dillard has a political approach that is critical to corporate systems by using minimal and sometimes bricolage gestures, and by adding online forms of representation and the user's access to it, he creates installations and performances both online and offline. Constant?
Yeah, my name is Constant Dullaart. I would like to thank the organization of the Internetional to put me on stage with these great artists. Also because I've made a work which dealt with, I think, a lot of the topics that were also addressed by these artists, and I think it's great that we get the chance to be in a conversation. First of all, I would also like to apologize to Amalia officially, since I was not aware of the extent of the performance while my performative gesture interfered with hers. But I do enjoy you calling me a troll on several interviews. I think this is still a compliment. I did give some slides. I'll try to be as funny as I can in 5 minutes, or the leftover 4 minutes. So I was invited to do a show about clowns. So I chose these people. And the thing is that there's, of course, like the fact that like validation or social validation, or even like can become kind of a quantified capital. This is, to me, this was an interesting structure because it's a, if you would frame it as a hacker, it would be a vulnerability, right? So it's basically a social vulnerability of a kind of a gesture that would, would think that the audience would be worth something. So I chose like a bunch of people that were all kind of actively dealing with the fact of having like an audience as a validation for their artistic gesture or for the gesture curatorial or whatever, let's say, cultural gestures. It's funny to see them 3 by 3 because it's never how I look at them on my phone. I always see screen grabs at the time, single one. Anyway, so I don't know how they're structured, but anyway, so these are people that you may be aware of. Let's see where it goes. This guy's sitting over there, right there. Anyway, but it was quite interesting because I was invited to do this, and I knew, of course, you can buy. Oh, there's a picture. Okay, anyway, whatever. So there's like I'm also slightly distracted, so my apologies. Now I'm even more distracted. So okay, so the fact you can buy followers. Let's explain the work. The fact that you can buy followers for Twitter or for Instagram, for all these things. I thought that was interesting because that's the vulnerability, right? So you can manipulate the number that you would use to validate your practice. Like even if it's your own branding, if it's your personal branding or these kind of relationships. So it's a weakness or a hack or whatever you can call it. So the cool thing was that I got the budget to spend and then it was all dealing about photography. So I was interested in these kind of fake profiles that pass the limits of like, they get accepted by Instagram as representing a persona, right? Like as having an identity, but they're compiled from that. Yeah, exactly. So they're compiled from all these kind of found images, and they're compiled with like, and they include spelling mistakes even to just pass the bar, because then they don't see that it's exactly the same as another one that they copied. So it's Mina is rocks. Anyway, I won't read it. If you read it out loud to yourself, it's sometimes funny. Anyway, but there's so these identities are compiled and they're artificial, but they pass the borders of like these identity checks of Instagram. But there are millions of them, so there's all these ghosts that are kind of giving us or me or whatever, if I would buy it, giving me the sense of audience, the sense of like instant gratification. And since working on the web, this idea of instant gratification or this idea of audience has become very important, as Brad highlighted and is still highlighting in his work, I think. And I think this is very interesting, where this becomes a kind of issue if this challenges the quality of the work or not. Like what is the intent of the work, if there's also a part in it that there's like a compromised idea of an authentic audience, right? So this is why I thought like, okay, let's buy 2.5 million. So I bought 2.5 million fake followers, which I think was a good deal for the guy in Estonia. But so I spent $5,000 on 2.5 million followers, and I redistributed them over a selection, somewhat personal, also somewhat random, but all of people that were involved in this idea of commenting or reflecting on or obviously using the quantified social capital as a validation for their practice or for what they were doing. But of course, in this idea, I was also kind of interested that they were living in this time of hypercapitalism, and then even the fake persona, the persona becomes a value. So if I follow someone, my interest in a person represents a value. And well, you can split 2.5 million through, you can divide 2.5 million by 5,000, and then you see $5,000, and then you see what the attention of one profile is worth. So I redistributed them over these 30 accounts, but of course I wanted, because we're living in these times of hypercapitalism, I wanted to spread socialism. Maybe it's because I have social background, whatever, like socialist background. But anyway, I thought, like, what if we try to balance out this system, right? Like, if one person is so much more important, like, there's this one guy that posts like post-its all the time, and he's like really relevant. And but there's like other people that don't do that, and they should be more relevant, or there should be other projects that should be. Anyway, so I thought like I should just equalize them all. So I equalized them to 100K, but sadly this was kind of hard to control, so everybody ended up around 120K, and this was just before the big, what is it called, reaping? the purge, the great Instagram purge, where all the like fake followers were purged, but then everybody was still left with what, like 63,000 or like something like that, like all these fake followers that still exist. Anyway, and now of course I'm spammed by all these people that are offering me new followers. So within a few months I'm going to the Philippines and like will build myself an army. But anyway, the thing is, this idea of like socialism within social media, within this hyper-capitalist time, was kind of interesting to see how people responded. And there were very interesting responses, but maybe I should cut that down because my 5 minutes are over. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. I think maybe it's also good if you, Amalia, say a little bit more about your Instagram performance, since also the previous speaker, Cadence Kinsey, told some things about it, and I think it's also good to hear your own sort of view on that and what your idea was to obtain with it, and what your sort of strategy was here.
My bad that I didn't see what Cadence said. So yeah, basically I was role-playing for 4 months in my own account in an attempt to self-destroy, in a way, my own self-branding, which I had been unconsciously interpreting for a while, as a female artist. So yeah, that was my attempt to destroy this, was to follow this, to role-play these different characters, which was just one female character going through 3 different phases, appropriating the most popular trends on Tumblr and Instagram and blogs in general. And so it started with aesthetic slightly similar to my own taste, so it wasn't too obvious that I was doing anything weird with my Instagram or Facebook. And this was kind of trendy, artsy Tumblr, anime, cutesy, bruises, models, pro-Ana statements, and all this stuff. And then the idea was to play with this glitch in social media, which is authenticity, and to play with these fictional narratives on social media, because people are not used to seeing these things in Facebook or Instagram. So yeah, slowly I would go through different phases and making people engage with the story using archetypes that everyone has seen previously in film. So everyone was very keen on believing everything was true because they've seen it before. So I pretended to have a boyfriend and split up with him, who was just a friend of mine in the photographs. And everyone wanted to believe it was true, and that I was really sad, and like, get over him, like, you'll find another boyfriend, etc. And then I became this archetype of the pathetic single woman, which is something that is always very represented in movies. And so I supposedly started being a sugar baby and like having a breakdown, doing coke and like all these things women do when they're single because they're too stupid. And then I would go to rehab, and so the second episode would be appropriating the aesthetics of kind of ghetto hip hop, boss bitch, Instagram sugar baby, which everyone wanted to believe it was true because it represented some sort of breakdown, and people love when other people are going through bad stuff. It's like it's very entertaining, and that's why people watch reality TVs. So after that, I pretended to go back to my middle-class family, which was also fictional, and be healthy again, be brunette again, and be into interior design and things that Gwyneth Paltrow would post in her blog, and also, having a family which also was fictional, and posing with babies, which is like this random baby that I pretended was my cousin, and like all these things. And it was very interesting because the audience, in most of my works, the audience is not that important, especially not internet audience, because most of my, most or all of my latest shows are more of an IRL experience, and they're like very, very difficult to translate through documentation to the internet. But this specific project obviously lived on how people reacted to this or follow every day, how they interacted with the characters, and definitely I would follow really closely who was following, who wasn't, who wouldn't follow, all the comments or the messages or the likes, and the changes in the audiences, because it would change very quickly from one episode to the other. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. And yeah, it was very, very important in this case to see how people interacted with it. Like the project wouldn't have lived without the audience. And it was important to see how many people were following in silence as well, depending on the changes in the narrative. Like when I apologize, and it was obviously a fictional apologize because of being such a whore. And there was like all these comments from all these people that haven't spoken to me in 5 years, being like, yeah, it's okay, you know. And thanks for apologizing. Or when I got the boob job, which was obviously fake boob job. There was all these people that suddenly sent messages being like, oh, you're so brave, or wish you best luck, or things like that. So yeah, and the project.
Because Brad, we
could probably just all have one, right?
yeah. And you can interrupt each other as well. Huh? We don't need to be that sort of brave and wait for my sort of questions or interruptions. But you wrote or you suggested we are living in a moment of artists without art. And Joel Holmberg mentioned that yesterday as well. Like as artists, we make our own audiences. So maybe we can continue a bit on that trend and like how you sort of deal with the issue of the social in the social media, and then the arts that you sort of respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I said that, I was mostly talking about this kind of like this new thing where, you know, the majority of our time is spent probably like surveilling and cataloging one another for all of the kind of extracurricular activities that we do outside of art production, as far as, you know, a community of artistic peers looking at one another, that our primary point of focus isn't solely the art that one another makes or going to shows by one another or something like that, but now we're kind of invited into the personal lives of one another, much as, you know, Amalia's project points to. And it also about a kind of like an entire cast of people who are maybe, you know, socially involved in art, or at least maintain an appearance of being so through liking, commenting, sharing, etc. people's work or opinions or whatever else, but don't actively make art themselves, and are kind of like visually identified as being part of the art world, but don't do anything in it.
But I think that always existed, right? I mean, it doesn't. It's not only related to social media and the internet. There was always people in the art world that, and especially very, very talented people that never produced any work of art and were just always like around in a group of artists. I don't think that's especially new.
Yeah, I think it gives it an interface for everybody to simultaneously view it, whereas before maybe it was only those friends were known to the people who they were around, but now everybody else sees those friends too, or something. But yeah, no, totally.
What is different then? I mean,
yeah, well, he said that like more people
the
see
Sue's valence of it.
Yeah.
The mutual understanding of what everybody else is doing at the same time.
Constant, anything to add to that?
Oh, no, I was actually wanting to ask you, Amalia, if you also tracked the people, like to what extent did you follow like all the information of the of the audience in the Instagram project?
Well, in the Instagram, it's funny how people act in different ways in different platforms. And Instagram is more about just liking things, and people comment sometimes. It's not relevant. But then it was on Facebook that I got all these like bunch of trolls that in every single photo they would say something really nasty, and like comments and messages. Like on Facebook, really, like it became way more intense. And that I did document everything. And it was very interesting to see, especially that the passion of certain trolls that started taking it everything so personally. And there was this guy that got obsessed with the character and started posting those pictures in his own Instagram and like making all these collages and like very, very angry. And it was very interesting to see like all these people like that I have no idea of, and like they're not, I mean, I don't think they're like even related to my peer group. They're like became very attached to the character. And that's what also became such a backlash at the end when I said, well, everything was a fiction, because people felt very betrayed. Like, all my hatred was directed to, to something that wasn't real. And I think that was the most interesting part of the project, is like to reveal that it was a fiction like everything else, but like everything is a fiction. And people didn't want to believe so. People were still very attached to that idea of like genuine, especially because they felt that whether it was hatred or, or they were fans, they felt betrayed because that wasn't true.
Yeah, so this is, I think, I've been thinking about the project, of course, a lot, and then I think this is one of the things because I was sitting in the train to a show with Alexandra Domanovic, and then we were discussing the work, and while it was still going on, and she was like, "This is crazy, you should follow," and then I was already following, and blah, blah, blah. But like, I checked into more detail, and then I felt like I was an accomplice by like supporting the character to do so, and then I unfollowed, for example. So then I thought like, oh, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore because I feel like I'm an accomplice and I'm supporting, which is now clear as a character, as a fictional story, but as if I'm wanting to be an audience. And this idea of like the complicit to a potential informal or like kind of implicit judgment on a kind of, let's say, well, you could even call it a parody, but even if it's like, if it's not like a clear implemented judgment, then added to the then it becomes a repetition. And I think this is something where I felt like the making complicit of the audience became interesting. I mean, I started to think like, is it like Laibach, for example, like the band in ex-Yugoslavia that was starting to perform with like right-wing uniforms and like these kind of things, and it's this interesting artistic gesture, right? Like it becomes kind of a figure of speech in which way to make that argument. But then I thought like it also becomes this kind of really interesting idea of like analyzing the audience, even like what kind of information can you get from the audience, of like how do people respond to these kind of triggers. It also becomes like an anthropological
It was interesting
research.
to test the art audience, because I was definitely not parodying any of the female characters I was role-playing. I have deep respect for all those sugar babies and their insane photographs they post, and like booty builders and like their bodies. I mean, it's insanely amazing, and I'm a big fan. So I think that more like if there was any sort of critique, it was more a critique on the eyes of the beholder, or on like the followers, and how would they feel about certain things.
But don't you feel that you're responsible for this too?
I was responsible on creating this uncomfortable situation where people didn't like what they were seeing, but they still looking at it. And that, like I know many people felt this contradictory, feel this contradiction in them of like, they knew that was wrong, that they, there's like, oh yeah, it's like this lady girl, like this is so ridiculous, but still I really like it. It's really enjoyable to watch, especially if it's like another person's meltdown. And like I really wanted to exploit that, the idea of the troll, of like people becoming trolls and having that relationship to others. I think that was very interesting.
Because Brad, you also wrote an athletes, which comes from one of your texts as well. Audience, once assembled, becomes part of their medium. And then, Constant, you also mentioned like this influence of Instagram, and I think that's also like one of the strands that sort of fits into this discussion. Like, what is the influence, and what responsibility you have there, or how do you want to respond to that with your projects?
Yeah, I think it's interesting now because I think everybody's involved in kind of commenting on this social validation of this the social capital, right? So I think in that sense, I think it's just interesting that there's like these three different kind of trajectories that like it's like different kind of arguments of dealing with this or trying to discover what this influence is, right? And the only thing which I feel is like, what kind of responsibility do you have as an artist, or not even responsibility to the world at large or something, but even to myself or ethically, to kind of comment on the moral implications of a medium like that, like even the cultural implications, like where I feel that this quantified capital or the structure in which it works even becomes kind of like cultural imperialism even, there where it becomes this kind of interesting discussion of like, how does it work in general, what kind of effect does it have, how is it building people's practices, how is it building social relationships, how is it building visual culture, how is it confirming certain popular themes, how is it like, I mean, in the end, what I was afraid of, and I've had like nightmares where I would end up like, I would have to discuss my work with Kim Kardashian's butt, because she had so much more likes, and then I felt like this kind of validation, in the end, becomes like almost becomes this ultimate populist argument, and this is something where I felt like, okay, I need to form an opinion and need to make a gesture that I don't want to do that, or I want to avoid this. And then I think this is something where I think this is interesting, that there's like different roads of like even participation. Like I feel like I was still doing that like by participating, but I think you were doing that by way of like participating, but like even loudly and like I think this is the interesting thing. And then I think there's I'm interested in like what kind of moral choices are made within this spectrum.
I also kind of wrestled with the populism aspect of it too, in terms of thinking about my relationship with that. Like, what does it mean to have 100,000 notes on something, or is that good or bad? How does it impact the art, et cetera? And I think that ultimately I kind of settled on the idea that that populism could serve as a bridge into this, the classic idea of like an avant-garde, like the idea of a merger of art and everyday life, and that potentially some of the things that I saw going on, at least in Jogging, could be this third rail out of this dichotomy that I read Boris Groys make about populism, which was that you can have undemocratic art that's extremely popular. So like you could have like a Jeff Koons or something like this that takes many millions of dollars to fabricate, that not everybody could make, maybe only a few people in the world could make, but that nonetheless the masses love it, right? So like everybody goes to Witte or whatever other museum that Jeff Koons is in to go see him. Or you can have a type of work that's very democratic that anybody could make for relatively nothing, and that the masses will hate it, that they'll see it and they'll go, oh, my kid can make this, this is elitist crap that you have to read a million history books to understand, or something like that. And that I suppose I came to view populism, or at least this kind of populism of the virality of posts on Jogging, the virality of other people's projects as well, that kind of hit a viral peak, as being an opportunity for a democratic art to also be popular. The idea for a blog post or some other form of art making that's open to many, to also being something that's open to many in terms of its viewership and in terms of people appreciating it.
But I think that's what, personally, I think that's what makes a piece of work good, is that it works at many different levels. And that's, for me, like I love Jeff Koons, and I think those works are good because they function on many different levels. Like, I don't know, as someone in the art world, I can appreciate it, and I know the story behind it, like then other people can look at it and be like, whoa, this looks amazing. And that reaction, I think it's very important to like have like a work that holds all this information within, and it's not necessarily something that is part of, like it can be part of a discourse, etc., but like it also functions in other ways. And I think that's, for me, it's like
but not everybody can make Jeff Koons work. Like only very few people can afford to make Jeff Koons work.
Yeah, but that was an example. But like there's many other works that function at many other levels, and I think that's
on both levels of this, or on both of those spectrums, I think, on both the elitist whatever and the populist museum blockbuster guy or girl or whatever.
I also wanted to still speak about sort of commodification and things like that, but I also see that it's quite late already, so I don't know.
Really?
Maybe we have to open up to the audience. Do we have a mic back there, or shall I bring one?
I have a question that immediately links this panel to the previous panel. If I look at all your 3 projects that you presented, then I could, with 1980s media theory, Jean Baudrillard, say they're really classical simulations, and really in the sense that the fabricated media reality replaces reality. But on the other hand, we have heard many statements, not just in the previous lecture at the symposium, that, let's say, the art that you're also representing or in which you are practicing is very much about materiality. So I'm just curious to hear whether you have an opinion on that, whether you would say, well, there is a material aspect or materiality aspect to our projects, or they really fall into this kind of classical realm of simulation and media as simulation.
Who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, so I had to speak when so it was 30 years ago that the Les Immatérieux was in Centre Pompidou, right? So this idea of the immaterial. So I'm still interested in like kind of reflecting from our current perspective and like these kind of Instagram gestures to look at this kind of these kind of immaterial materials. And I still think that this is like this social fabric becomes part of a material, right? So this becomes moldable, or like it becomes moldable to an extent that even the audience becomes material, and this becomes moldable. I don't know if this is like a somewhat superficial answer to your question, though. But I do think that this is interesting. That this becomes part of like the choices that you're making, right? Like it becomes a part of where I felt like I made this piece, which was Jennifer in Paradise, where I framed a picture within a certain romantic story, and I think the framing of the story and how it was received and how the people saw and read this and what kind of audience engaged with it was part of the work, right? Like the fact that I printed out on all these really cool materials, and I can do a lambda print, and I can use all the quotes that all these other people can also use and make lenticular prints and all this stuff is fine, but it's still the context of the story has become the material. And I think this is the challenge now, because of like this kind of impact of it, this social fabric becomes the material. This is, yeah.
Anybody else? Question?
Yeah, I was wondering, these are all like projects that are in some way like they're part of your artistic practices, but they also, especially in the performance you did, Amalia, you talk about that other works are far more better to view in IRL, but I do know that you had this virtual kind of, how you say this, walk through your show at James Fuentes.
Yeah, that was an attempt to have something online for people to kind of understand what was in the show, because it didn't photograph very well. Mm-hmm. But still, it doesn't, like, it's totally different from like the IRL experience of that show, which is, it was totally immersive, and like it did require people to be in it and feel what the space created around them. I mean, it was the same in my last show in London as well, because of the use of different elements like the change in the interior design and like adding different smells and sounds and everything like that. That was also, it looks good in the documentation, but like the lived experience of the shows is totally different. And that is something that I always, one of the things that I liked about the post-internet, whatever, was like what he said about photoshopping materials together and creating these shows that maybe you couldn't afford to do, like, and you have the concept of the show, and that's something I always liked a lot about it. And Katia is especially good at doing that. But then I grew very disappointed when I remember I was at the Pompidou, and this is a very like stupid story, but like so this Joseph Beuys felt piece, it was all covered in felt, and it just felt so beautiful. But it felt beautiful. It wasn't like it looked good. Like I couldn't even photograph it. It looked like shit in photographs. But then I remember going to post-internet shows and looking at the works in person and be like, Jesus, it looks horrible. The photographs are beautiful, but then it doesn't really feel like anything, which is part of the thing. But I didn't really like it personally, because I do feel that there's more to art than just images. And there's a lot of other things like music, for example, and sound, spoken word, and smells, and whatever, you name it. And that's why I've started doing more and more shows that involve more of that. But I always try to keep also works that function maybe just online, like the performance.
Does it make much more sense to you to work within monopolies like Instagram or Tumblr, for instance, or do you have an opinion about that?
Constant.
No, I wasn't paying attention. Sorry.
Well, I know that you left Facebook, but you did make this project in Instagram. I mean,
Yeah,
could
which
you
is
say
Facebook.
something
Yeah.
About that sort of opinion on working within monopolies and trying to sort of subvert their...
Yeah, I
or-
mean, I think this kind of comes back into the other thing is that like I always feel like I'm a kind of cliche moralist, but I think this is we're like flooded by all these fucking American corporate systems that are like influencing our visual culture and are actually adding these tropes to us and like how social relationship have to influence how we think and like I mean this is like it's like this kind of really sorry, I'm just being kind of direct here now. Like I think it's like this little spider in my brain that is like American and is like this kind of cultural imperialist gesture that I have to work like for popularity. And this is something which in my personal life I was fed up with, so I kind of disentangled it from Facebook. And then of course, like just as the branding, it was kind of fun because I was in Moscow with. I don't know, like Artie and like Jeremy Bailey and all these people, and everybody was on Instagram. So it's like, okay, I'll try this out. And then I was trying it out until it became interesting as a material to reflect upon it again. And I think this is what I still want to do. Like I reflect upon it because sometimes I feel these things cringe with like the value system that I'm from. And I think this is interesting that we're living in this kind of idea of like a kind of global medium and that we're talking about these things, but then in the same week, I'm sitting in Hong Kong looking at like a panel about 89 plus, and then like people are not referring to like 1989 in China, or like are not referring that not everybody can access all these platforms that we're talking about there, and that it's not everybody is in this middle class system where we can deal with this kind of visual culture, and this kind of inherent cultural implications become really important for me that to reflect upon like from a certain locality, from like my local culture, or like even think about like how other cultures reflect on it. Like for example, I saw Douglas Copeland in a talk where he said like, yeah, so if the yak farmer in Tibet gets internet, he'll probably go to TripAdvisor and like watch YouPorn. And I'm like, no, motherfucker, like he won't. Like he's actually in Tibet, which is China, which is he's behind the firewall, so he has to pay money to access a VPN, or he has to know what to do.
But also, it's not so much about that, but also about the keywords. So, I mean, and I know this because I'm not American, I'm not English. I grew up in Spain, and for me, projects like even like the Jogging, but I remember especially Dump FM. At the very beginning, I really did my best to understand the jokes. And I was like, I don't understand. Like, why so this pizza? Like, why?
Yeah.
I mean,
pizza,
I was
all the time fucking pizza, it's true.
Like, it was like all these, I mean, but it's like, it's totally like a different background. So I was there as a, like, very poor, struggling to eat. And like, there was all these bored teenagers using Dump FM, making all these jokes about, Milan and my house, internet, pizza. And I was like, yeah. Cool, like trying to follow it. But it didn't really represent at all like my background. And I feel like there's this monopoly of on the internet of like American culture, especially considering that that's like worldwide, that it functions the same way everywhere else, and it's not really like that. And I feel that many people try to adapt to that, to be able to be part of that and like be able to laugh at the joke. I mean, like, For Loco. I was like, what the hell is For Loco? I remember because that didn't exist anywhere else. And like, things like that it became like such obvious thing for many people, but then they keep on forgetting that the world is not just that. And that's something very interesting about the internet and how people have this idea of how everyone can participate in it and how the man in Tibet will go to Pornhub. Even if he has the access, maybe he doesn't even know.
Yeah, and maybe he doesn't even want to, you know? Like,
yeah, of course.
Like, why would you implicate that this man wants to? Also, why does the yak farmer have to be a guy, by the way? But anyway.
I think we have time for one more last question. 2. We can do both.
You just mentioned that mostly like there's this kind of American influence on global internet, and I wonder also relating to what Brad I think said earlier, that it's kind of all organized by majorities and by populism. So I wonder if there was like a broader access to another population, like let's say China, for example, would get an open internet. Thinking of this perspective that the internet is kind of a majoritarian brew, and it all goes about popularity, masses, amounts of people following or thinking in a certain way. Do you think also there could be a completely different, I don't know, like let's say global internet culture, let's call it like that, all this dump FM stuff, coming from a different population or broader population reacting to this global cloud?
There is. I mean, go to China and log into their social networks. Go to Russia, go to VKontakte, go to South America even, go to their social media. There definitely is, and there's different tropes. I mean, of course there's like certain memes that are widespread, but there's I think there's a lot of Chinese I can't read, and I did catch like a visual repetition in there and a lot of memes. So in that sense, I do think that there is already. The only thing is like, there's still language barriers and there's still geopolitics within our access to information. It's still current. It's not like they wouldn't have access. They have access, they're doing it. It's just that we're not seeing it.
Okay, but let's say those barriers would be removed.
It's
or like language barriers and cultural barriers. Well, it's interesting because the European Commission is trying to get that done, at least within Europe, because within the United States, it's actually, I don't know why I'm pointing there, sorry. The United States is actually, yeah, I don't know if 9/11 was an inside job, but no, sorry, sorry, this is, no, but like, they are trying to do it, so they are trying to do these things because, of course, like it would be good for trade. So people could make money on it. But what if we all use? I don't really understand the question because it's basically already there. Like I can use Google Chrome and access Chinese websites and have them translate it on the fly. So it's like the barriers are potentially.
Yeah, but I think also it's like cultural differences, because even if you understand the language, there's many things that get so lost in translation.
Yeah, of course. But like for example, like I was like watching American TV. Like I know what this means. Why do I know what this means? Like, no, but it's like all these things. Like, of course, it's so embedded in like how I grew up already, or how we grew up, or how everybody grew up, that it's like that it's really hard to cross these barriers. And this is, I think, why we need cultural institutions, why we need these kind of discussions. This is why it's interesting that this post-internet show was in Beijing, and this is why it was like if it sets up this kind of a dialogue, then I think it becomes interesting. But I think that should just be maybe enhanced or something. I don't know.
No, it's still super difficult because when I look at the internet in South America, like Argentina, Chile, whatever, I understand all the jokes and because my parents are Argentinian. And then from Spanish internet also I understand and I get it. And whenever I'm trying to translate that, it just is impossible. And I think it's more than just like Google Translate. It's like way more complicated than that. But there's definitely I think each country or area has like their own like internet bubble with all these like memes and information and like different social media platforms. Yeah. Like Chinese, what is it? Weibo?
Weibo, yeah. Weibo and now Weixin actually, but the like more mobile phone based. But like I think if you're Dutch, you would know kakhiel, maybe. Yeah, see, so the smiles there are like totally not related to anybody else. Like it's, having
Or
these
in Spain, 20.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think we wrap it up here. Thank you for participating.
Thank
and
you,
thank
guys.
you to the audience.
The International.